I don't see the types of long-term economic progress that's needed to revitalize the area.
"40 Years of the Business Journal" is sponsored by Compco and these participating sponsors.
I got here in 1980, and just that's a short time after Youngstown Sheet and Tube was closed, and now U.S. Steel was closing its shop, and some of the jobbers that are associated with the steel industry were collapsing also. And Youngstown had become a metaphor for deindustrialization in the national newspapers, and I was doing a number of interviews with Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and other major publications. At that time, you saw the beginnings of the decline of other industries, such as auto, and I think that was the sort of next stage of the deindustrialization that was going to occur in the Youngstown, Warren area. I think of Youngstown as Mahoning Valley, so it's a greater Youngstown then. But and I didn't see a recovery coming. I watched numerous attempts to retrain for jobs that were going to be non-existent. The example I usually use is there was a lot of emphasis on computer repairing. And the computers, that lasted about 2 years until you just had components to slip in and out if you were having trouble with your computer. And you also saw the migration out to other parts of the country, even though there were talks about jobs coming back, or these not jobs, but people coming back from places like Houston, which had a place called Little Youngstown in the late 1980s, early 1990s.
Oh, really? Was that a lot of Youngstown refugees? Congregating in Houston?
And the Texans used to talk about they didn't like the number of blacks who were coming to Houston, but they weren't talking about African Americans. They were talking about black license plates who were coming from Ohio. So it was really interesting. I talked to them because the first time I heard the description. So, and I think that decline, despite incredible talks of optimism by the business leaders, and appropriately so, that's part of their job, is to be very upbeat. But anybody who's looking around could see that the area was in a steep decline and was not ever going to recover. The population declined, the housing stock being just emptied, Youngstown was burning in many ways because of all the house fires that occurred. And I think you could see that this was, and certainly became the metaphor for the country on deindustrialization. We weren't the only place that was suffering this, and the Garys and other places like that. But it was certainly what Sherry and I call in the book the American imagination of Youngstown, because it was industrialization, the war effort, and then the deindustrialization. Youngstown played a very important part of America's story. And again, we titled the chapter Youngstown's Story is America's Story. So it sort of mentioned, that Youngstown was never going to really recover, was never going to go back to what it once was. The question became, would it be enough to stop the hemorrhaging? And it did. It slowed down, but it continues even to this day. You can see, as I look around the city in 2024, if you look carefully, you can see that the landscape is dotted by empty lots. The types of business that are surviving are smaller machine shops. The major institutions have collapsed. You can go to the north side and see the North Side Hospital, or what we call North Side Hospital, is empty. We saw what's happened out at GM Lordstown. And so, in general, we see that Youngstown continued to decline, but at a much slower rate, and is sort of holding on. I think that the most recent one that's really concerning me is the university. cities and economic development often occurs around universities. And what's happened at the university now with the cuts and the downsizing and defunding is what happened. It doesn't bode well for the future of the city.
So state funding's
state
pulling
funding,
back, and that's going to have an implication on not just Youngstown, but
all over the place. But at Youngstown, particularly, if you don't have other options, that type of institutional funding provided by government is crucial.
What about labor gains? I mean, it was a big gain to wrap those battery plants into the national agreement. I mean, it's one of the biggest victories for the UAW in
Absolutely,
decades.
Absolutely. The UAW should really fought hard on that. I was doing the interview, I think, with the Washington Post about that particular fight, and I thought that the UAW really made a pitch. There were people that, by the way, that were not happy with that because they just wanted their own raises at the assembly plants. But they went out of their way to make sure the battery plants got organized. They were paid a decent wage, and so on balance, I have nothing but kudos to say about the UAW and what they did. And I think it's important because you got to keep those wages up because to keep the economics of the area improved. And people don't realize how important those plants are to the economic development for small businesses in the area. But it's still limited from what it was.
Right. And we've seen the whole economic landscape change from '84 till today. I mean, it was a rapid decline.
It was enormous. The decline was incredibly rapid. And resulted not only the corporate restructurings that were going on and the deindustrialization and the globalization that was going on, all at the same time really impacted industrial areas, strongly industrial areas like Youngstown, Detroit, Gary, if you want different sizes cities. And it really changed the economic fortunes of the people in those valleys, in those places. And nothing has ever really helped recover that. The service jobs that came, the healthcare jobs that came, did not pay as much. And of course, if you talk to the small business people who depended on the wages and salaries of people in the industries, major industries, they were impacted also. There's always this tension, as Sherry and I write about, between the type of cruel optimism that some people talk about and the type of adaptive resilience that we see in the Youngstown area and downtown. But the West Federal area changed, and partly changed because of the banking industry changed in this area. And there was downsizing of that and purchases by PNC and other places, other banks, that gave less of a sense of economic prosperity. When the outside banks came in, deposits and other things were shipped out of the area. They didn't stay here. That's not true for all banks, home savings and loan and places like that. They continued to do okay. But a lot of resources left the area because of banking. Youngstown was used in a different way than it was before in terms of economic development via the banking industry. So while places like Pittsburgh prospered, I did an interview with I think it was Pittsburgh Press a long time ago, and said, yeah, Pittsburgh is looking good. It's being rebuilt in part by PNC and Youngstown money. You know, just they weren't happy with that, and I don't know if I got into the story, but the point of it is that it was another type of extraction of capital, human and economic, that was occurring. Youngstown didn't have the resources. And plus, in general, economic development was occurring not just in places like Pittsburgh, and I don't want to overrate that, because
Yeah,
you go 10 miles outside of Pittsburgh, and it's like Youngstown parts of it.
Oh, sure.
And the further out you go, it gets worse. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the movement and economic development was to the south and the southern states.
What has the region done right?
I think they've tried enormous numbers of tracks to attract new businesses to the area. You know, the housing situation has been dramatically improved, because there were, 4,000 or 5,000 vacant homes, and now there's less than 600 was the term I heard recently. And so the landscape is changed by what is there and what is not there. You look at, ride the neighborhoods, and you see these vacant lots, and you know those were all homes. It looks nicer. The grass looks actually pretty well cut, given what's going on, but you know that there's been an incredible loss. I think more recently, the institutional foundations of the city are being offset, because the decline of places like the Youngstown State University, the movement of part of the hospital complex to the suburbs. So I know that the city's trying. I know the economic development money from the federal government is trying to improve that, and you see attempts to spruce up downtown, but I don't see the types of long-term economic progress that's needed to revitalize the area. So to answer your question, Danny, is that I think the decline is not as steep as it was when we started talking about this 40 years ago.
Right.
But now it's still slow. But again, I will keep repeating that Youngstown's story is America's story, especially for small and medium-sized cities around the country, and even to a lesser extent to larger cities.
And the whole manufacturing landscape has been upended as well in many cases.
It is.
It's not the same as it was 40 years ago.
No, and this is what this area depended on. It was never a service economy. It was always an industrial economy, and with great companies like General Motors and Delphi and Packard Electric at that time. Yeah, there's been a change in the landscape for sure, economically and demographically, and politically now too.
Youngstown is in a strange position in that it needs workers to fill these jobs.
Well, I think that's part of the tact that the university is taking. Is we're going to make this a real vocational university instead of one that is more diversified culturally, economically. So you've seen, again, the declines of the Youngstown State sort of represents the push toward vocational education that's going to be needed for these so-called jobs when they get here. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's sort of a brain drain from what we talked about earlier. There's a lot of smaller economic development businesses, smaller businesses, that were largely fulfilling a role of jobbers for small projects and stuff like that. That is now declining somewhat too, and their workforce has many skills, but they might not have the skills necessary to operate some of the new technologies. But part of that, when I tell this story and talk about it, I always think of the Harley plant in Wisconsin, Harley-Davidson. And those of us who grew up, and I'm 78 now, we all had this sort of male fantasies of Harley-Davidsons and bikes and things like that. And when I was invited to come out there and take a look at the plant, hoping to see all these machinists working and very skilled, I saw people that were simply machine tenders. A block of steel, or metal, would put on the conveyor, would go into this automated machine. The guy would push a button and sit and read the paper, and out would come 30 minutes later parts. Mm-hmm. Completely de-skilled, other than being able to push the right buttons and put the stuff on top.
Right.
And that's kind of what labor-intensive work was shipped offshore. And technology replaced it, and all this was seen as progress.
Yeah. Yeah.
The question that Sherry and I write a lot about is progress for whom?
Uh-huh. Right.
And I don't want to be a technological phobe or something, but I know that technology is not going to be the answer to a lot of the questions that we have continuing in terms of economic development. And we're right on the cusp of another major change, which involves artificial intelligence. And that'll be a question that I'll be asking you. What's happening in terms of Youngstown and the uses of artificial intelligence?
"40 Years of the Business Journal" is sponsored by Comco and these participating sponsors.